Okay, very good. Shane, thank you. And thank you to the chamber for everybody here. And maybe watching this later, I appreciate the opportunity to help and present the legal requirements for starting a new business. My name's Tom Riley. I'm an attorney with Riley and Stingley in Fulton. And I've been advising businesses from startup to mergers and sales, and from one person to grocery store, pharmacy chains, businesses with hundreds of people. But frankly, it was only this year that I even started trying to set up a new business. The Brick District Playhouse is the theater that we're renovating in Fulton, and we decided to operate our own cafe. So we're setting up the Playhouse Cafe, and it's part of the charitable nonprofit that we have, but it is a new separate business. And I was frankly shocked by some of the red tape and everything that you've got to go through when setting up a business. So hopefully I'm going to walk you through some of those issues. And I've got a PowerPoint that's on the screen here, and I'll kind of walk through that. The other material that we have available, and I'd be glad to email that to anybody, and Shane also has that, is a Word document with websites and links to the actual information, and in some ways, the actual online form. So my hope is that I give you some good context of what you need to address, but also do more than just, hey, here's what you've got to talk to your accountant or your attorney about, so that you don't have to hire one of us, and probably you want an accountant more than you need an attorney. So we want to do some self-help, give you a lay of the land, and try to dispel some of the issues or misconceptions that have existed. So, Michelle, I'm doing that Zoom. All right, so that'll help. Okay. So starting with the really the beginning, let's talk about the choice of legal entity. And because there is a decent amount of misinformation out there about that. So the oldest kind of business that you could have is a sole proprietorship. I literally just start selling barbecue, and it's Tom Riley Barbecue. And that is a sole proprietorship. I don't have to file anything. It's not a separate entity. It is just me. The second kind, and we'll go through these all in detail, but the second kind is a partnership. So they're Sam. So Sam and I decide it's Tom and Sam's barbecue. And we can just enter into an agreement about how to operate that, and that would be a partnership. There are several types of partnerships, but generally it is the same thing. It's just two people doing something together. The third kind of business, and really the first kind that is a separate entity, is a corporation. So that's a shareholder corporation. Most of the big businesses that you think about are corporations, and they end with Inc., incorporated. And then finally, an LLC. That's the newest version, and as we'll see, it's probably the preferred version now. That means limited liability company, and that can do pretty much everything a corporation can do. So when you're starting a new business, you got to figure out what entity you have. So again, the first possibility is a sole proprietorship. You're literally doing it yourself. It has the benefit of not requiring any sort of startup work, but it is, in most cases, a very bad idea. So what you have, if I'm operating the Tom Riley's barbecue stand, is it's me. If something goes wrong, if I own property and somebody falls and hurts their head, if one of my employees runs over somebody, I have unlimited liability. It is me operating, and so every penny I have could be at risk in the venture. So it is almost never what you want to do. There is potentially one thing you should do if you are going to operate that way. If I'm going to have Tom Riley's barbecue stand or Riley Barbecue, I need to register a fictitious name. It's actually a crime to use a name that is not the name of yourself or the name of your entity if it's not registered. And you can register a fictitious name for 5 years. I think it's $7 on the Secretary of State's website. There is a link to that. The key takeaway with the sole proprietorship is don't do it. The only thing worse than a sole proprietorship is a partnership. So that's, Sam and I are wanting to be in partnership. Well, now we both have unlimited liability. There is nothing there. It is not a separate entity. And it also does not provide a good mechanism for management. It's very hard to impose these rules. Partnership is not what you want to do. So we'll spend a little bit more time with what the two decent options are. So the first is a corporation. Corporations were not anything heard of until about the 1600s, when you may have heard of like the East India Trading Company, and they were government grants that allowed private enterprises that were typically overseas traders to let people invest money and not put anything more than the money in the business at risk. And that has remained the defining characteristic of a corporation. If I own a corporation and that corporation is liable for something, all that is at risk is my investment in the corporation, not my personal assets. That's what's called limited liability. There are several types of corporations, but I think for our purposes, you can think of them really as separate only for tax purposes, which we'll get to. A corporation is a state entity. It's formed by filing articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. And there's literally a link, and you can fill out an online application, and you submit fees of, I think, about $75, and you'll get a certificate of corporation, and you've literally now formed your corporation as a business. Doing that is not everything you need to have. Corporations have to have bylaws. And so that's not something that's available on the web, but that's what tells the corporation how to run. A corporation is managed by its board of directors, and the directors are voted by the shareholders. And so those are often one and the same people. And a corporation has to file an annual report with the Secretary of State showing who those directors are, showing who the officers are, showing who the registered agent is. And that annual report is, I think, $45. So about 3 decades ago, limited liabilities companies came in, and they are frankly simpler and more flexible. So your larger corporations, if you're thinking about General Electric, that's a corporation. If you're thinking about Microsoft, that's a corporation. But most of your small businesses and the startups that you all would be thinking about, if you do an entity, you probably want to do a limited liability company. So a limited liability company has the same limited liability. You do not have at risk anything more than your investment in the company. So it also, as we'll see, has the same benefit of what's called pass-through taxation. Bottom line is you don't have to pay tax twice. It also is very easy to run. You can literally make the limited liability company, an owner of that is called a member, and the member can just manage it. So it simplifies things. Think of corporations or what is a good idea for an organization with 500 shareholders and a big board of directors. And so what it has in place is appropriate for those, but for smaller companies, you typically want an LLC. That's created by filing articles of organization with the Missouri Secretary of State. Again, that's something that is online, and you can just fill those documents out. Now, it typically won't have everything that you need because a limited liability company needs like an operating agreement. And those are, again, the internal rules. And a limited liability company can be set up where it's run by its owners, its members, or it's set up by its managers. And it doesn't have to file an annual report, and it doesn't have to file an annual fee, which you don't think one document, 45 bucks a year, is a big deal, but it's easy to overlook and it can cause a lot of problems. So I would recommend a limited liability company. If we're really trying to cut to the chase, that's going to be the most flexible thing you need. You can get the easiest to run, and it provides the right protection. A very, very key element, though, is if you have a separate entity, that's what an LLC is, you need to run it as a separate entity. So you need to have a separate bank account, and you don't commingle the funds with your funds. So you might contribute money to the limited liability company, and you might take dividends out. I mean, the whole point is to get money from your business, but you don't commingle it. You have contracts in the name of the LLC, and you have bank accounts in the name of the LLC, and that's how you would operate it. So that's the overview of the type of legal entities. And if anybody doesn't have any questions or anything, and I'll try to loop back for any questions at the end, let's go on to the next topic, which is taxes. And yeah, taxes are complicated, as we all know. But there are a couple things just to keep in mind. A detailed analysis of like the tax code, and that's going to be on the scope of what we have. But there are some things to just keep in mind, and I think especially to know just in terms of the origin of some of these and how some things are different, because I see a lot of people making mistakes because they don't kind of keep all the tax issues separate. So when you get a separate entity and you set up a limited liability company, and a couple of people go into business with one of your buddies and you set that up, that's a separate entity. So what does a separate entity need? It needs a separate entity tax number. If I'm just doing my own business, I'm using my social security number. My social security number is a tax identification number. But for a business, you have to apply for one, and that's a federal taxpayer identification number, also known as an employer identification number or an EIN. You can get that online free from the IRS. You fill in a form, and again, I've got a link to that, and you fill in, and you would already have set up the company, and you'd have the LLC, and you'd have the name, and you'd have an LLC number that the Secretary of State gives you. You use that information and you identify who the owner is and who the person in charge is, and you fill out other information, and they give you then back online immediately an employer identification number. And that is your number for federal income tax purposes. It's also the number they use to identify nearly all of your dealings with income tax, withholding, and other issues. And so all of a sudden I have Riley Barbecue LLC, and I have an EIN number for it. One of the key things that is a big issue in some of your more complex businesses is how they are taxed. But for your purposes, you definitely want what's called pass-through taxation. If I set up a separate corporation, and it's a big corporation like GE, it's called a C corporation. They pay taxes. And then when they distribute money to the owners, they pay taxes on that too. That's called double taxation. It's not what you want in a small company. It sometimes makes sense for larger companies where shareholders just get dividends, but you want what is pass-through taxation, and you can get that simply by filing and electing on an IRS form. So as a corporation, you would elect to be what's called an S corp, and for an LLC, you'd have pass-through taxation. So just something to remember, and also just again to keep in mind that that's different than the next part we're going to talk about. This is sales tax, and we will see people all the time when someone asks for a sales tax number, they will give the federal employment number or vice versa. The sales tax number is issued by the state. There is a link to that application in the materials we provided. Frankly, it's kind of a pain to get, which I found out when we started this for the Playhouse Cafe for ourselves. You need to have your entity set up. You need to have the employer identification number. You actually have to apply to the Department of Revenue to show that you're not past due on any taxes, which of course you're not. You just set it up. And then you have to get a sales tax number, which is heavily audited, heavily regulated, because it is frankly where a lot of people don't pay their taxes. And when I've seen big tax liens and big liabilities, it normally arises from people not paying the right sales tax. So if you have a business that just does services, I just do legal work. We don't have a sales tax number. If I go paint your house, I don't have a sales tax number. I sell you, real estate. That's not the same thing as sales tax. So we're talking about a restaurant or, a widget store, whatever. That has a sales tax. You have to get a sales tax number. You apply for it. Sales tax is the primary way, or one of them, that funds local government. So in Fulton, it's 9%. It's different virtually anywhere that you go. You've got a county sales tax. You have a city sales tax. You have schools that have taxes. You might have tax districts, and they all pile that money up. And what you do is you pay 9% of your sales if you're in the city limits of Fulton. And so when you get a sales tax number, you have to pay the equivalent of what 3-month sales tax would be. And then you either pay that by getting a bond, or you just pay it in by a check, or you get a letter of credit or a CD from a bank. So that is very involved. And then you have to really stay on top of submitting all the sales tax at the right time. You submit it to the state then sends it to the county splits it up with the entities that they're supposed to. So that's the next big step. We've set up the entity, we have the federal tax identification number, we have the sales tax number. So the next thing is really getting licensed. We've got kind of the tax setup and the legal setup, but now you've just got to make sure you're licensed. So some licenses require occupational licenses. If you're a cosmetologist, they've got a license. If you're a realtor, it's a license. If you're an attorney, there's a license. So there's some occupational licenses, and you just need to be aware of that. Then there's a city business license that is issued by the city of Fulton. If you're going to set that up here, I've got a link to that. Pretty straightforward, pretty minimal application, and there's also a county one. So what that does is let the government know what businesses are out there, and by law, the money that they charge, which aren't huge amounts of fees, are really designed to just fund the county officials or city officials, like the health inspector, somebody to make sure that we know who's out there operating businesses, and so that they're not running some sort of scam. And that's really what those licenses are about. They're not too difficult, but you sure need one. So now getting into the biggest issue with a new business is employees. And this again can be really a lot of information, and most of the things I reference are probably things you're not going to need to worry about. But I do have links in the document that ties into each one of these laws and some other information you can find out yourself. So you got to have an EIN, and then based on that, you have to withhold taxes. If you have employees, there is part of their tax obligation and yours that are called FICA taxes. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Those are payroll taxes. And so as a lot of us know, if you're an employee, you see that being withheld. You can also withhold some of your own income tax that you might pay at the end of the year. And the employer has to submit that for you. And so there's a link to the Department of Revenue website, and that is something that you have to set up. And that's an issue where, frankly, you might want the assistance of an accountant who helps with some of those. Next, you have unemployment insurance. You've got to pay insurance based on the number of employees and then based on the number of people who eventually quit or are fired for something other than misconduct. Those employees who lose a job are to be looking for another job, and then they receive some compensation and unemployment. So we probably heard a lot about that with the COVID relief. There was additional money provided by the federal government that added to some of the state employment benefits. You, as the former employer, do not pay those. It's paid by insurance. However, you pay an insurance premium. So if I pay an insurance premium on my car and I run into something with it, my insurance might pay for it, without a deductible. But guess what? My premium's going to go up next year. And the same thing applies with unemployment. To the extent you have a lot of unemployment claims, your insurance will go up. Just a minor aside, but if anybody is thinking about buying another business, that's something that I see big problems with, and it's normally with large transactions, but you will have an employer buy out the assets of another business, and they can actually get stuck with their unemployment bill. So again, just something to be aware of your record with unemployment, and certainly if you buy out any other business. The last probably thing that you've got to deal with is workers' compensation. If you are in the construction business, or if you have 5 employees or more, you've got to have workers' comp. And workers' comp is another government-run insurance program. And the idea is that if an employee gets injured, they can't sue their employer for negligence, but they also don't have to prove negligence. They just say, I was injured on the job. And then there's a statutory formula to figure out, okay, well, we'll pay your medical bills. And if you lost a left hand, it's this much money. Or if you have some other permanent injury, it's this much. And it's a really complicated and rather inefficient system. But one thing to know is if you got 5 employees and you don't have workers' compensation and one of them gets injured, they can file for workers' comp. And there's something called a second injury fund, which is just another pool of money that they could get paid from. And then you're getting sued by the state of Missouri and it's a crime. And they go after it like crazy. So if you've got employees, make sure you know you've got workers' comp if you need it. So I'll then talk about a couple of other employment-related issues where we just see not everybody kind of knows it, and sometimes a little bit of misinformation can be pretty damaging. So first off, Missouri's an at-will employment state, and that is really significant, and it's what some people don't think of when they are an employee or they hire ones. And what that means is so Riley Barbecue LLC hires an employee and I don't have a written contract. I don't have, oh, you're hired for $20,000 a year and it's a 1-year term and I can't fire you. It's just, hey, you're hired. I hire you today, you can quit tomorrow and I can fire you tomorrow. You don't have to give me 2 weeks. I don't have to give you 2 minutes. And I can't get in trouble for just firing you. It is at will. If I'm no longer willing to employ you, you're no longer going to be my employee. Now, that is obviously subject to exceptions. If I fire you because of your race or gender or religion, sexual orientation, other protected classes, those are acts of discrimination, and that's obviously not okay. But the basic thing of like, I just think this person's doing a bad job, I don't really want to hire them, but I'm worried, can I fire them? And generally the answer is yes, they're at-will employees. So that is an important distinction to kind of keep in mind, and it's a reason that I often advise employers not to have employment contracts that guarantee a specific term, because it does get more difficult. And then frankly, it's why you would, if you've ever worked for a big company and you've read an employee manual, it gives you all these rules, and then it says like 20 times over, oh, this is not a contract. You're an at-will employee, because it's then people like me who drafted stuff like that, so they could continue to have those rights. The next employment thing that I think is important to understand is the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. Most of the time, we don't really think about that because it's kind of obvious. I hire somebody to come paint my house. That's not my employee, that's an independent contractor. I hire someone at the Playhouse Cafe or for Riley Barbecue to serve as a cashier. That's an employee. And those, a lot of distinctions are drawn from that, and some people try to play games with it where it's a problem. So the issue, if you're an independent contractor, if you're my independent contractor and I hire you to paint my house, I'm not withholding taxes. I'm just paying you. I might end up asking for your tax ID number, and I could send you a 1099. So if I've hired somebody to do a lot of work for my business, so somebody to paint my barbecue shack, I will want to deduct that. I will ask the independent contractor to submit their tax information on a W-9, and I send them a tax form. But I don't withhold taxes. I don't have to pay unemployment. It's not workers' compensation. So it's much better to have an independent contractor relationship. But the state does not allow you simply to say, oh yeah, that person's an independent contractor. It is all based off of it's a 10-part test, but it's, do they decide their own hours or do you? Do they decide how to get the work done or do you tell them what to do? Do they have their own equipment or do you provide all of the equipment? Is there a certain term? And what it tries to get to is the difference between the cashier, 8 to 5, they're in charge. If I tell them not to do the cashier stuff and instead turn the ribs, they're an employee. The person who just comes in for a few days and paints is not. So just make sure you understand that distinction and really the risk. There is a lot of aggressive enforcement that the state does when they think somebody should be classified as an employee and they should be getting unemployment insurance and some other things from the employer. So the next set of letters there are all just acronyms for different federal laws. Federal Labor Standards Act, Family Medical Leave Act, Occupational Safe and Healthy Act, Health Act, Americans with Disability. I have links to all of those within the documentation and would just recommend that you look at them. Most of them are based on you having to have a number of employees. And so there are a lot of these laws, like the ADA, like the Family Medical Leave Act, that require a certain number of employees. Although some of that was changed even with the CARES Act and the COVID rules, particularly family medical leave. But that's going to be beyond the scope of what we're talking about with opening a business, and hopefully you don't have to deal with those issues too much. So finally, I've got a number of other issues that didn't fit too well within any particular classification, but I want to talk about a little bit more, and also want to show a couple of things that I would definitely recommend everybody check out. So hopefully, and Shane, speak up if you're not seeing this, but it should be my internet browser. And so this is Open for Biz MoGov, and
We're,
that, oh, sorry.
we're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me try this. Did that make a difference?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Well, I'm going to open that back up. Just let me tell you these sites. So Open for Biz, Open for FOR Biz, biz.mo.gov is a remarkably good site. It walks you through steps for a startup, registering for online employees, hiring employees. So it also links to most of the other things eventually that are in the document that I have. So there is openforbiz.mo.gov. And then there's also, if you just search for Small Business Administration, start your own business, that has a ton of helpful information too. So again, I'll be happy to email all the links. Those are some of the links, but if you just remember those two, I think anybody starting a business should look through those two sites. So a few then other miscellaneous issues where I think everybody needs to keep in mind. So we talk about limited liability entities. And the point again is that if somebody has a claim against my business, only my assets that are in the business are at risk. So somebody falls and breaks their head open on my barbecue shack. One of my delivery employees runs them over. They have a claim against the business, but it's limited. A lot of people think that means that if I have a limited liability entity, then you can't sue me personally, and that is not true. What I mean by that is I have a business. I'm a shareholder of Riley Stingley. It is a corporation. It's a type called a professional corporation. It's a limited liability entity. But if I commit malpractice, you hire me to do something and I just do it wrong, negligently, there's a claim against me. Same thing at the barbecue shack. Riley Barbecue, well, great, but I'm the guy who didn't notice there was a nail in your pulled pork. I'm going to be personally liable. So don't think that you don't have any liability for your own personal actions just because you own a limited liability entity. That gets to the importance of insurance. More than anything else, insure. Get a general commercial liability insurance policy. So that makes sure your business is named and make sure you are named. You need that for casualty insurance. What it's called is if they pay you for damage to your own things, but also liability insurance so that they will defend you. And spend some time to look at your insurance policy. They often will give you your insurance policy, they say, but it's actually just a declaration page of the coverage. So the policy itself is often 50 pages and 10 pages describes what it covers. 40 pages describes what it doesn't cover. So I was literally in a mediation today about insurance, and it was everybody talking about the exclusions. So as difficult as it is, sit down with your agent and look. You can't always negotiate all of these things out, but a lot of times there will be exclusions that will relate to something that you do, especially if, say, you're doing bungee cord jumping or you're having some business that involves some risk. You need to deal with that, but get insurance. And then once you're done, get more insurance. There's a type of policy called an umbrella insurance that covers anything above and beyond other insurance policies. You don't need it very much, but for that reason, it doesn't cost very much. So do think about that. next, just a few pointers on dealing with customers. And there is this idea that you can't have an oral contract, and that's not true. We have agreements all the time. I literally, if I'm handing a can of beans to the grocer, I'm making an implicit agreement to pay them for that. If I have a deal with a customer, yeah, I've got a contract. Now, contracts to sell real estate, contracts that are not performable within a year, contracts by which you guarantee somebody else's debts, or certain contracts that do require a written contract under the statute of frauds. But you can have agreements with your customers, and they can be oral. The better approach is always to try to have something contractual if it's not this one-off thing. Here are your beans, here's your $2. That's important for both sides to know what they're dealing with. I would say half of contractual disputes are genuine misunderstandings of what each party was going to do. So sometimes it is helpful to say, I'm going to paint your house, and well, is it one coat or two? Does that include some portion of the house? That sort of thing. The other things contracts can do, and this is where I think there's no question, but you need a written contract. If you're going to have customers who are not paying you immediately when you're done, you need to address the fact that they may not pay you. So check out the scenario in the absence of a written contract. I cater and I deliver 100 sandwiches over to the Chamber of Commerce, and I've got a bill of $1,000 and they don't pay me. And let's say it's not good old Callaway County Chamber, but it's probably Audrain. I'm sure they stink. So all of a sudden they don't pay me, and I've then write them a letter. They still don't pay me, so I've got to sue them. So first of all, if you don't have a provision that says you get your attorney's fees back in the contract, you don't. So if you have to file a lawsuit for something under $10,000, it almost doesn't make any sense to do it economically, because a lot of that may be taken up by attorney's fees. And that is completely solved by literally a line that says, if you do not pay when the bill is due and we have to hire an attorney, you are liable for court costs and attorney's fees. Then you get them. Then all of a sudden, pursuing a $3,000 debt might make sense. Yes, you might not find the people. Yeah, they may not be collectible, but if they are, you're going to get $3,000 plus your $1,500 in fees. The next thing you do is impose an interest rate. You can have an interest rate really as high as 18%, 1.5% per month. Call it interest. Penalties are not enforceable, but now all of a sudden they're not paying me. Oh, okay. I get my interest and I get my attorney's fees. And then finally, select the jurisdiction you'd be in. I had somebody last week who had a really well thought out agreement, and it was an app, and it was a non-disclosure agreement for people to help them develop it, who with another company that really does a great job out of India. And there's no venue selection clause. So how likely is somebody from Missouri going to go to India to try to collect? When all you've got to put is, if there's a dispute, the exclusive jurisdiction is Callaway County, Missouri. So literally those three lines, and you don't have to hire me or another attorney. Like if you just had in an invoice, you get your customer to sign it and make sure they're the right person who signs it. If it's a husband and wife, get both the husband and wife to sign. Under Missouri law, if you have a claim against a husband but not the wife, you can't get their marital assets because they're owned together. Get the right party to sign something, and at least include a few lines that say, you'll pay me interest. If I have to sue you, you'll pay attorney's fees, and here's where the court will be. So a lot of times, I think those are the situations where you're kind of done and you're not getting paid, or you're not paid in advance. Frankly, that's where these things come in handy. I guess the last thing then I'd mention here is about, business owners. And if you have a one-person business, everything is so much easier. And in fact, even for married couples, I advise just one being the owner if they can do that. And it doesn't affect whether it's marital property or divorce. It simply allows it to be run so much more cheaply. And again, even if limited liability didn't work, you wouldn't have a claim against both spouses. If you do have a partner, not only do you not want a partnership, but then it's probably where you do want to get an attorney to draft up an agreement. There are so many issues that can come up. Nobody goes into an agreement with the other party thinking that someone's going to breach it, right? I mean, it's like inherent in the very nature of agreeing to do something. You think you're both going to do it. And most of the time, everything works out. Most of the time, you literally don't even need to look at anything that was signed, which means you wouldn't have to have anything. But in those cases where you do, it is sometimes bad faith on one of the parties. Sometimes it was something that people should have foreseen, but oftentimes it's just circumstances change. You get a dispute, a business grows. One person wants to invest more money in it. One person doesn't. I'm in the business of Sam and I want to sell out my interest, and Sam doesn't want to be new partners, or worse, somebody wants to sell some interest to me and the other owner is like, no. Somebody gets disabled, somebody passes away. There are just a lot of circumstances that can be relatively easily addressed. And that's something that if you're going to start a new business and you've got more than one owner, you really need to, at a minimum, think through these other issues. What if I want to expand and put in more money and you don't? What if I want to sell, but you don't want to buy it? What if I want to take out more money than you do? What if we have a disagreement? Or then what if you're not dealing with me? I become disabled or I pass away. Think about those issues on the front end. They're not terribly fun to think about. They're not always really easy to resolve. But one thing I will guarantee you is it's easier to resolve at the front end when everybody's optimistic and looking at things objectively than it is after things have hit the fan and everybody's mad. Yeah, that's pretty much what I had to cover. I would be glad to answer any further questions if I can.
Do any of you guys have any questions?
With an LLC, in our business, we have assets. So is there any amount of assets you would have before you start separating LLC 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, good question. And I don't think necessarily it's a function of assets and risk. So look at it this way, back when there were cabs in New York City, they were so risky that every single one was set up in a different company. So you got $2 million worth of assets, but it's one big farm that you rent? No, probably not. And so I don't know if there's any bright line rule because it is so risk dependent. I think one of the things that so many people have are rental houses, and rental houses are pretty risky. And you can set up, the thing about an LLC, once you have one, you can set up another one that's just pretty much a mirror image if you run them differently. So I'll often see people with like 5 rental properties, and and again, it's how much debt is there, how much equity in there, but you've got $500,000 of equity in rental properties. That to me, and it's a very kind of uninformed, shoot from the hip type of guess, but that's it. But it really is, it is a function of risk. But you're right. I mean, having a basket that prevents everything else from being attacked is good. But if you put all of your eggs into it, then it's not. But to torture that analogy further, I'd just say like how risky is carrying the basket. And so it does depend. The riskier it is, the more you've got to set it up. I've had people though who have every single rental house in a separate company, and And frankly, they're filing 10 tax returns a year. And to me, that would be a little bit much. I guess the other thing is a little dependent on also insurance. To the extent you can inexpensively insure most of the risk you're facing, I think it makes it less of a need to split it up. All right, you guys are too easy on me.
Let me ask one quick question. Is there any steps or precautions? I know this is something new, but is there anything right now that a business owner or somebody starting up a business would need when dealing with COVID?
Yeah, good question. I mean, other than not doing it right now. So the Family Medical Leave Act, with employees, there are issues. The rules for giving employees paid time off has changed. And I think that law is actually still in effect. The other things would be more ordinance based. Like I was over in Columbia, and as you know, then everything is wearing a mask. Here in Fulton, we don't have that. So those sorts of precautions are an issue. Shane, rather more indirectly, you know, cost of funds are dirt cheap right now because of the fiscal stimulus and all the economic issues. But, you know, no, in terms of like most of the things I went through, except for a few of those federal laws, there really isn't anything different other than just simply being aware of the health risk to employees and customers.
Sam, if you want to shoot me your email address in the message, I'll send you those. I'll send you the documents, and I can send you this PowerPoint too if you'd like. Okay. And Tom, is there anything else that you can think of that you would like to share this evening?
No.
Okay.
No, appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody, and hope you all and anybody else looks at this later, enjoys it. No, that's it. Thank you all.
Yeah, we really appreciate you taking your time to come on here and do this. I know I learned a lot. This was very informative to me, and I'll definitely pass this information along. We recorded this, and I'm sure at some point we'll either have it. Justice usually puts this up on our YouTube page. We do have a YouTube page for the chamber, so I'll make sure and send you a link to this as well, so if you need to go through anything. But we definitely appreciate Sam and Susanna, you guys being on here. And if you guys have any questions, you know, you can reach me at the chamber and through phone call or email. And Tom, we really appreciate it. You have a wonderful evening. And if anybody needs anything, feel free to contact me, okay?
All right. I thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank
have a good
you.
evening.
Bye. Oh, shoot.